It was a scandal that shook Great Britain and sent shockwaves through the corridors of the intelligence community in America. Harold Kim Philby, Guy Burgess, Donald Maclean, John Cairncross, and Anthony Blunt would become known as the Cambridge Five. They were well-bred, highly educated members of Great Britain's ruling elite. Between 1940 and 1951, they penetrated the highest ranks of Britain's most important secret and political institutions. They played a secret game of cat and mouse as they procured the most sensitive secrets of the Crown and handed them over to Soviet agents. From this building, the KGB received crucial information from the group they called the Magnificent Five, forwarding it to the Kremlin, where Joseph Stalin received up-to-the-minute information about British and American activities on matters of critical importance. To this day, there is considerable debate about their movements, their methods, and their motivation. But there's little argument that they were the most successful spy ring in history. The five all attended Cambridge University, 60 miles outside London. It was the early 1930s, and Cambridge was synonymous with academic excellence and social ritual. The best minds from the best families walked the halls, competing for intellectual honors and learning the subtle social skills necessary to succeed in British society.
The milieu was one of privilege, fine education. They all joined various political clubs. Maclean was actually briefly a member of the Communist Party in Cambridge. You know, one of the great oversights of British counterintelligence was not to have realized this, but he convinced them that this was a youthful aberration, and he changed his mind.
Donald Maclean was the son of a well-respected diplomat. Kim Philby was also the son of a full-time diplomat and Arab scholar. John Cairncross came from a working-class background, but distinguished himself early on as a gifted linguist with a brilliant mind. Guy Burgess was Philby's close friend. He was brilliant, excessive, and sought out for his ability to entertain with a biting wit.
Burgess was one of those English, quote, characters, unquote, of the 30s. He was gay, outrageous, loved shocking people, drunkard, but he was tolerated because he was absolutely brilliant.
For different reasons, all were considered the best that British society could produce. When the five men entered Cambridge in the early 1930s, the revolutionary ideology of communism was gaining worldwide attention. Communism promised to cure social ills that Cambridge students could witness close to home.
They'd seen the way that the Depression had devastated the British working class. They'd watched the hunger marches pass through Cambridge. They'd watched the rise of Nazi Germany. And they all came to the conclusion that A, capitalism was not going to be able to cope with the coming crisis, and that B, the democratic nations weren't being able to stand as a bulwark with the rise of fascism, and that the only possible hope against this rise of fascism was Moscow.
A young idealistic professor lectured the students on the benefits of communism. Few knew that the professor was working for the Soviets.
The man who was chiefly responsible for recruiting first Kim Philby and then the other members of the Cambridge Magnificent Five was probably the ablest controller the KGB ever had. His name was Arnold Deutsch.
Arnold Deutsch fanned the flames, but the sparks of their rebellion were lit by travel in Europe between semesters in places like Vienna, a hotbed of political intrigue and action. In Vienna, communist ideology was often fused with a philosophy of sexual independence and rebellion that appealed to the Cambridge Five.
What tends to be forgotten is that the Magnificent Five were all of them sexual rebels as well as political rebels. Two of them were gay. That's to say, Burgess and Blunt, at a time when gay sex, even between consenting adults, was illegal. One of them, Donald MacLean, was bisexual. And the other two, Kim Philby and John Cairncross, were heterosexual athletes.
Cambridge was a place where important social contacts were made. These contacts would sweep the Cambridge Five into positions of influence. This social network also gave the Soviets entree to Britain's ruling class.
They all knew each other. All the KGB had to do was recruit one and then ask that one person to recommend somebody else. And of course, in no time, they had a whole Cambridge ring.
For many Europeans, the 1930s were a terrifying time. Dictators like Mussolini, Hitler, and Franco began tightening their stranglehold on their countries and created alliances that threatened both the Soviets and the British. The Cambridge Five believed they were recruited by the Soviets to fight fascism, not to betray the crown.
The Soviet recruitment pitch was really quite subtle, quite shrewd. They rarely declared themselves to be Soviets. They declared themselves quite often to be working for peace. A pitch was, would you like to work for peace? Are you a committed anti-Nazi? And the answer to that was an enthusiastic yes. It was not, would you now like to work for a foreign totalitarian regime?
By 1937, each of the Cambridge Five had graduated from Cambridge University. At the time, the looming threat of war provided opportunities for them to distinguish themselves. In 1937, Kim Philby landed in Spain to work as a journalist. Francisco Franco, a nationalist general, was struggling to take power, fighting to overthrow Republican rule. Joseph Stalin didn't trust Franco and wanted him assassinated. This was to be Philby's first mission. But with tight security, how could Philby get close to Franco? As would happen so many times in the story of the Cambridge Five, luck provided a means that no amount of planning could ever have matched. While Philby was traveling close to the front, a Republican shell landed near his car, gravely wounding the other passengers. The wounded Philby became an instant hero in Spain.
Philby was decorated for gallantry, and one of those curious ironies, it was in fact General Francisco Franco who awarded Philby with his medal.
Fortunately for Philby, the capricious Stalin changed his mind about killing Franco, an act that would obviously have ended Philby's spying career. As the clarion call to arms began to sound, neither the Cambridge Five nor their Soviet handlers had any idea that the tumultuous events ahead would catapult them into positions of authority, giving them access to the most important secrets of World War II. As Philby made a name for himself overseas, the other members of the Cambridge Five were busy back in London gaining access to the corridors of power. Guy Burgess landed a job in radio where he had daily contact with powerful and influential political leaders.
He, amongst other things, worked for the BBC as a talks producer, that is, sort of documentary or interview programs. And because he was in that position, he was able to invite really quite remarkable people onto the program. And he then had an opportunity to ingratiate himself, to entertain them, and to make some pretty impressive connections.
British leaders like Winston Churchill thought Burgess epitomized the best of the young British aristocracy. By 1939, it was clear Britain was nearer to war. That year, Stalin betrayed Western leaders, entering into a pact with his enemy, Adolf Hitler. Many ardent supporters of communism then turned away from the Soviet Union, recognizing Stalin's opportunism as a sign that perhaps the Soviet Union didn't embody the utopian ideals it espoused. But the Cambridge men couldn't admit they had been wrong.
Instead of admitting they were wrong, they simply persisted. They were also intellectually arrogant to an extraordinary degree, and in the end, that was their undoing.
By the spring of 1940, the Cambridge Five found themselves in the middle of the greatest military enlistment in Britain's history. Overnight, top-secret organizations like MI5 and MI6, the domestic and foreign divisions of the Secret Service, were expanded. The sudden need to staff newly created war agencies provided opportunities for two of the Cambridge Five to enter the clandestine world of British intelligence. Donald Maclean entered the Foreign Office, the diplomatic corps of the British government. Maclean had access to top-secret political plans, but Guy Burgess would be the first Soviet spy to compromise the British Secret Service.
Guy Burgess was effectively recruited both by the Secret Intelligence Service as a propagandist and who had a knowledge of radio, and by MI5, who used his homosexual talents to recruit and run agents. So he had, in effect, feet in three different camps: the homosexual world, the journalistic world, and the secret world.
Burgess's contacts were considerable and his intellect highly regarded. At first, his eccentric behavior was not only tolerated, it was valued.
You would think that such a man who drew such attention to himself was not the ideal person to be a spy. But it works both ways. People would say, Burgess is a spy? You know, Guy couldn't possibly be a spy. I mean, look at the way he behaves. So his outrageous behavior was actually, you could argue, a good cover for being a spy.
MI6 was Britain's top-secret agency. This secrecy made it easy for Burgess to recommend Kim Philby. Philby's first assignment in the British Secret Service was in Section D, a new division designed to help defeat the Germans through secret missions and dirty tricks. During the day, Philby trained recruits in the uses of propaganda. At night, he helped himself to the secret information contained in MI6 files.
He's able to go through methodically, file by file, noting all contacts throughout Europe. And this is gold dust for the KGB.
Thanks to Kim Philby, the Russians knew the identity of most of the MI6 agents operating in Europe. Throughout World War II, Guy Burgess, Kim Philby, and Anthony Blunt were stealing intelligence from their peers. But it was John Cairncross who would give the Soviets some of the most important secrets of the war.
The fifth man, the last of the Magnificent Five of new Cambridge graduates to be recruited by the KGB, is John Cairncross. But up until the end of the Second World War, he's arguably the most important British agent that the KGB has. More important even until that point than Kim Philby. Why? Well, partly because he runs through such an extraordinary sequence of highly sensitive jobs.
In 1941, John Cairncross's expertise in mathematics brought him to work at this secret government office, an old mansion known as Bletchley Park. Bletchley Park was the home of a top-secret division of MI6 dedicated to breaking the German code. The decrypted German communications, codenamed Ultra by the British, were the most closely guarded secrets of the war. Cairncross had daily access to this critically important intelligence, and he passed it along to his Soviet handlers.
John Cairncross was able to supply ultra intercepts that were directly relevant to German troop movements on the Eastern Front, and he is widely credited as having made a very significant contribution to the Battle of Kursk.
At Kursk, 6,000 tanks and 4,000 airplanes took part in what would go down in history as the largest tank battle of the Second World War.
Now, it is the German intercepts provided by Cairncross which tell the Russians where the German airfields are on the Eastern Front. And before the Battle of Kursk, the Red Air Force is able to bomb them. And even by contemporary Russian analysis, that makes a really important difference.
Thanks to John Cairncross, the intelligence the Russians had on the Germans was some of the best of its kind in the history of modern warfare. But stealing the secrets was only half the challenge. Methods had to be devised to transfer the information to their Soviet handlers.
There were two theories about this. One is it's a good idea to meet in an isolated spot where you can see for miles around that there's nobody near keeping an eye on you. Other theory is that it's best to meet in a very crowded place where the idea of people chatting and exchanging papers and talking and being busy and everything like that is that you lose yourself in the crowd.
Kim Philby often preferred to take important papers home, copy them, and then arrange to leave the copies in a secret location.
One method of communicating was with a thing called a dead drop. And as the name implies, it's a drop where the agent will leave material for the KGB officer to pick up. After the agent had left it there, hoping that nobody else would accidentally pick it up, it would be collected very shortly afterwards by the KGB officer.
Despite the risks of meeting in London, Guy Burgess preferred to meet the Soviets in public. Occasionally, things went wrong.
He met one of his controllers in a pub in London, carrying secret papers that he'd smuggled out of the office that day. In the process of handing them over to the Russian, he dropped them and they were scattered all over the floor of this pub. And there was a policeman having a drink, off-duty drink at the time, who actually bent down and helped them pick them up and put them back in the folder again.
In communicating with your contact, it's not only important to obtain information from him, but also periodically to hold personal meetings, face-to-face meetings. It's very important from the point of psychology, because an agent, he's alone with his secret. He has nobody to share it with. And his contact, his intelligence officer, he's the only person who can discuss most things with him.
While the Russian military used the secrets provided by Cairncross, Joseph Stalin didn't trust some of the information coming from the Cambridge Five. Stalin's paranoia infected the agency charged with evaluating the intelligence supplied by the Cambridge Five. Why, the Russians asked, didn't the British Secret Service have major operations directed towards the Soviet Union? They didn't believe the truthful answer found in Philby's reports.
There was a war on. Britain didn't actually have time for major operations in Russia, as well as against the enemies, Germany in particular. The KGB can't believe that. I mean, there is a paranoid mindset which is not limited to one or two officers, but which is the politically correct attitude in the KGB at that point. So when Philby says that there are no major operations against the Soviet Union, which was the absolute truth, they think that this is deception.
During the war, Joseph Stalin had unparalleled access to the military and political secrets of both his enemies and his allies. More importantly, thanks to members of the Cambridge Five, the Soviets had meaningful information about Britain's atomic program. They had joined forces to beat a common enemy, but by 1946, Western leaders were already casting a weary and nervous eye towards the Soviet Union. The Cold War was heating up, and the Cambridge Five were soon to feel the pressure of spying not for an ally, but for an enemy. During much of World War II, the Cambridge Five had been spying for an ally, but the Cold War heightened the danger of their actions. By the late 1940s, Maclean, Burgess, and Cairncross held important positions in governmental agencies. Kim Philby was the only one who stayed in the British Secret Service. Philby's wartime service brought him to the attention of Stuart Menzies. So impressed was Menzies that in 1946 he put Philby in charge of Section 9. It was a new division of MI6, charged with planning counter-espionage activities against the very country Philby was spying for, the Soviet Union. It was a remarkable coup for the Russians.
All the time that Philby was head of the anti-Soviet section of British intelligence, every single operation they mounted, aggressive intelligence gathering operation, they mounted against the KGB had been betrayed beforehand.
One of those operations was the ill-fated Albanian mission. During World War II, secret commandos had been used to fight the Germans behind enemy lines. Many in the West felt that the same strategy could be used behind the Iron Curtain to liberate the countries of Eastern Europe held hostage by communism. Albanian freedom fighters were trained in Malta and sent into their mother country, only to be immediately picked up by officials who were already aware of their arrival.
Philby manages to betray those Albanians who are being infiltrated by sea, by land across the frontier, and by air. They came like lambs to the slaughter, and Philby was responsible for the slaughter.
Just after the war, while Philby was working his way up the ranks at MI6, Maclean and Burgess worked at the Foreign Office, stealing important secrets of Britain's Cold War strategies. Maclean's post at the Foreign Office had taken him to Washington, D.C. during the war. At war's end, Britain and America began planning their strategy to combat and contain the Soviet Union.
Donald Maclean had very considerable, important access to political decision-making, positions that were going to be taken in negotiations with the Soviets, contingency plans, reactions to the occupation of various different countries, treatment of émigré governments, all of which was of very considerable political importance to the Soviets.
Maclean made frequent trips to New York to meet his handler, turning over important information about the Cold War to the Soviets. As a cover, he visited his wife, who was an American living with her mother in Manhattan. But friends and family noticed that Maclean was acting strangely. The pressure of leading a double life was beginning to show. He began to drink heavily and started to raise suspicion with his irrational behavior. The heat in the Cambridge Five was turned up. They led secret lives, knowing that the punishment for treason could be death. Anthony Blunt was the first to succumb to the pressures.
At various moments, all of the Magnificent Five, with I think the exception of John Cairncross, cracked or came close to cracking. The first who really worried the KGB was Anthony Blunt. He was so close to a breakdown at the end of the Second World War that he was allowed to go part-time. He only does the KGB odd jobs, but some of them were quite important after the Second World War.
As Blunt receded into the shadows, Donald Maclean was sent to Washington to work for the Foreign Office. Guy Burgess had left MI6 and had also taken a job at the Foreign Office in London. In 1950, the first Cold War military crisis presented the world with the alarming possibility of another major war. This time, Korea was the country that would ignite a tinderbox of tensions. Truman and Stalin watched the conflict closely. British leaders were concerned that America was willing to risk war with China and perhaps the Soviets to protect Korea from communism. Britain began working to prevent America from beginning another world war.
They decided they should hold talks and thresh out all the problems with the Americans. And they prepared special instructions for their group. And all this bunch of documents was passed to Stalin. It was clear from those documents that the West will not go to war with the Soviet Union about Korea.
Anthony Blunt was out of the Secret Service, but he was still helping his friend Guy Burgess.
Burgess and Blunt, they worked as a couple. Blunt had left MI5 and was not formally even connected with any secrets. So he was outside the circle of suspects, beyond suspicion. And of course, it was much easier for him to meet Soviet contacts. At the same time, he was able to meet Burgess because they were lifelong friends. And he would take those papers from Burgess, photograph them secretly, and would pass the film to his Soviet contact.
Largely thanks to members of the Cambridge Five, Stalin knew just how far America was willing to go to protect Korea. But his intelligence didn't stop there. Among the many Soviet agents working to uncover atomic secrets, few were as important as John Cairncross. Before his arrival at Bletchley Park, Cairncross had briefly worked for an important advisor to Churchill, helping with plans to build a new and devastating weapon of war.
In 1940, he becomes private secretary to one of Churchill's ministers, Lord Hankey. He headed the Scientific Advisory Committee, which considered, amongst other things, the making of the first atomic bomb. And it was via Cairncross, using the minutes of Lord Hankey's committee, that Cairncross becomes the first of the atom spies. They hear it first from Cairncross.
By the late 1940s, Cairncross was once again privy to atomic secrets.
He was working in the Ministry of Supply, but he had access to a safe during that period which contained all the plans for Britain's nuclear deterrent and the expenditure on the armed services, information that the Soviets regarded as very significant indeed.
Soviet scientists, using the accounting ledgers and inventories supplied by Cairncross, were able to recreate and piece together some of the materials and steps required to build an atomic bomb. By 1950, the Cambridge Five were seasoned veterans in a complex game of cat and mouse. While the exact nature of many of their transgressions is to this day known only to a few in the British Secret Service, it's now clear that they provided the Soviets with volumes of information about the American and British intelligence services. For almost 10 years, the Cambridge Five had escaped detection. But they began to fall prey to a dangerous level of comfort and confidence. Philby would later speak of the hazards of letting one's guard down.
I remember Philby telling me that first time, maybe second time, third time, maybe a dozen times, when you're going to meet your contact, you always check yourself for surveillance and so on and so forth. But then suddenly you feel so secure that you don't do it anymore. You just walk out of the SAS building and in 20 minutes you meet a Soviet contact. Whereas under normal procedure, one should have spent 2 or 3 hours proving himself for surveillance.
For Donald Maclean, the pressure of leading a double life became more than he could bear. Transferred from Washington, Maclean was given a post at the British Embassy in Cairo. In Cairo, Maclean finally fell apart.
Donald Maclean does have a nervous breakdown, although it's of a pretty bizarre kind. It reaches a peak, I suppose, in Cairo, where he was a British diplomat, in the spring of 1950. And with one of his friends, he goes on an extraordinary mission of destruction to the apartment of 2 secretaries working at the American Embassy.
After a brief hospital stay, Maclean was not only reassigned, he was promoted and sent back to London. Far from arousing suspicion, his behavior was attributed to his intense devotion to his work and his long hours of service to the Crown.
Amazingly, despite complaints from the American Embassy, he subsequently went on to head the American department in the British Foreign Office.
At the end of the 1940s, Kim Philby was sent to Washington, D.C. as an MI6 representative. It was there that he learned of an alarming secret project, a project that would spell the beginning of the end for the greatest spy ring in history. By 1950, the Cambridge Five were beginning to weaken under the intense pressure of living secret lives. Their days as Soviet spies were numbered. Kim Philby and Guy Burgess had been transferred to Washington, D.C. Donald Maclean had left Washington and, despite his unstable behavior, had been named head of the American Division of the Foreign Service. Evidence of serious personal problems notwithstanding, the Cambridge spies were supported by the very system they were betraying.
It is truly astonishing the way in which they manipulated the system, the class structure in this country, social mores of the time, in order to be able to advance their own careers and prevent themselves from falling into some of the most obvious pitfalls.
The head of MI6 was so impressed with Kim Philby that he appointed him as liaison to the American Secret Service. By 1950, Burgess had also been transferred to Washington, where he had access to important documents on Cold War planning being conducted by the British and Americans. When Burgess arrived in Washington, he moved in with Philby and his family, an unwise but necessary decision given Burgess's health.
Burgess was getting worse and worse. I mean, his health was suffering. He was drinking too much. He was on the verge of a nervous breakdown.
By living under the same roof, Philby and Burgess had broken the first rule of spying, and it would soon prove to be their undoing. The beginning of the end for the Cambridge Five came in the early 1950s. During the Second World War, messages from Soviet embassies in the West were routinely intercepted by American intelligence. But the time-consuming process of decoding these secret communiques made progress slow. As the Cold War began, however, the decoding of these old messages became a top priority. The effort by the Americans to intercept and decipher these secret messages was codenamed Venona.
In 1944, there was some evidence that there was a leak in the British Embassy in Washington. Between 1944 and 1949, an enormous amount of work was done on intercepting and decrypting some of the Soviets' most secret telegrams.
Philby's status in the Secret Service gave him extraordinary access to the progress of the Venona project. Breaking the code was a slow process, but soon important clues about Soviet agents were emerging. An agent with the code name of Homer was identified, and some important information about his personal life was revealed. Kim Philby knew immediately that Donald Maclean was Homer.
It became clear from one clue that Homer was based at the British Embassy in Washington and that he had been given permission to regularly visit his wife, who was pregnant, in New York. And that person was Donald Maclean.
Knowing it was only a matter of time before Maclean was discovered, Philby and Burgess had to find a way to warn Maclean, who was over 3,500 miles away in London. Any direct communication was out of the question.
The answer was, since Burgess hated his posting anyway, had fallen out with most of his colleagues in the State Department, why don't we get him sent back in disgrace? So Burgess took a car trip in a big, ostentatious car and broke the speed limits of, say, 3 states, and then each case was insulting and rude to the arresting officer, claimed diplomatic immunity. The governors of the 3 states complained to the State Department, who complained to the embassy, and Burgess was effectively told to go home.
Back in London, Burgess was able to meet with his old friend Maclean and warn him of the investigation. But journalists and scholars now question the truthfulness of this plan to warn Maclean. It's possible that Philby told this story because it's what he wanted people to believe.
There are a few flaws in the story, however, we dissident spy watchers wonder about. If the idea was to get him back quickly, why then did it take 6 weeks before he actually left?
Philby might have told this story to protect another secret agent in MI5, one whose identity remains a mystery to this day. What happened next is not disputed. Burgess understood that Maclean would have to defect. In his unstable condition, Maclean would never hold up to interrogation. Nor could he make the trip and escape alone. Burgess would help him. Passage was booked on a weekend cruise across the Channel. Since the ships on this cruise docked for only a day in France, passports were rarely checked. Burgess and Maclean quietly slipped into France and then together vanished behind the Iron Curtain. To this day, only the KGB knows the exact route they took. Maclean's defection surprised the secret services of America and Britain, but Burgess's defection shocked everyone, including his former housemate, Kim Philby.
When Philby discovered that Donald Maclean had escaped, I think that he must have been absolutely delighted. He was equally horrified to be informed that Guy Burgess had defected with Donald Maclean. That was never part of the plan. But it subsequently emerged that Maclean was so shaky at that stage that Guy Burgess really didn't believe that Maclean would be able to make the journey on his own.
Philby's career as a spy was over. His friendship with Burgess instantly made him a suspect. Acting quickly, he took measures to ensure that there was no proof against him.
When Philby came under suspicion in Washington and he thought that the FBI might descend on him at any time to search his house, he didn't want to be caught with his Minox camera and the other apparatus that he was using for communication and for photographing documents. And he had to bundle them in a bag and go out into the woods somewhere near Washington or over the border in Virginia somewhere and bury them.
The British Secret Service had let Maclean slip through their fingers, but they intended to follow every lead. In another ironic twist of fate, investigators turned to one of his best friends, Anthony Blunt, to gain entry to Burgess's home.
Almost fortuitously, he accompanied the two officers who went into Guy Burgess's flat and searched it, and he was able to go through Guy Burgess's desk and retrieve some incriminating material, while two officers were in the bedroom examining documents inside a trunk that Guy Burgess had left under his bed.
But Blunt missed one very important clue. Notes not in Burgess's handwriting that documented a lunch conversation with a British civil servant.
The British security authorities went to that civil servant and said, "Did you by any chance keep a diary for 1939? He did keep a diary. They said, "Would you look up on such and such a date and tell us who you had lunch with?" He looked it up and he said, "Oh, John Cairncross." They went and checked Cairncross's handwriting and it fitted. So from that moment, Cairncross's career as a Soviet spy was ended.
By 1952, the spying activities of Burgess, Maclean, and Cairncross had been revealed to the authorities. John Cairncross was safe from prosecution because British law demanded high standards of proof for treason. Kim Philby was living under a heavy cloud of suspicion, but his remarkable luck was about to save him yet again. By the mid-1950s, the Soviet Union's most successful spies had been compromised, their undercover careers terminated. Philby was still in London, highly suspected by British intelligence. Blunt and Cairncross's involvement was still hidden from the public. The press had learned of Burgess and Maclean's departure for Moscow, but few in the West knew how they'd been received by the country they'd served so tirelessly as spies.
From the moment they began to turn up in Moscow, certain elements in the KGB said, wait a minute, why suddenly have we got all these agents coming over here, defecting, when in some cases, like Burgess in particular, it wasn't necessary? Could it just be that this is one of those devilish long-term plots by British intelligence, who they attributed much greater skill and ingenuity and double dealing than actually it ever had?
After a brief stay in Moscow, Burgess was transferred to a small town on the Volga River, a place where the KGB could keep a close eye on him. His chronic alcoholism began to take a toll on his health. Throughout the 1950s, Philby lived in limbo, carefully watched by the British Secret Service. He was out of work and drinking heavily. Officially, Philby was persona non grata at MI6. Unofficially, there were those who remained loyal to him, unconvinced that he was in fact a Soviet spy.
There were two interrogators who confronted Kim Philby. One was a former MI5, wartime MI5 officer, Helenus Milmo. He adopted a rather bullying and blustering approach to Philby, which Philby in his memoirs says that he resented. The other approach was Jim Scarden, MI5's resident interrogator, who adopted the more fatherly approach, arm over the shoulder. Now come on, my boy, let's talk through what must have happened.
Then, as had happened so often in his career, luck intervened. Marcus Lipton was a member of Parliament. Acting on a tip from a secret source, he accused Philby of being a spy.
That caused a statement to be made by the government in the Commons, which was extremely unfortunate, but it was in effect exonerating Philby because at that time there was absolutely no evidence against him, and the government was obliged to clear him publicly.
Philby took advantage of Britain's libel laws, demanding either proof of the charges or an apology. Since proving the case was nearly impossible, the government was forced to exonerate him publicly. Once again, the master spy had gotten himself out of trouble.
Philby held a press conference, and he used that occasion to, in effect, start again, to ingratiate himself in the newspaper community, and he was subsequently assigned to Beirut as a journalist, as a newspaper correspondent for The Economist and for The Observer.
In Beirut, Philby spent time with his ailing father, and he began to write articles for the New Republic. Remarkably, he was again approached by the ghosts of his secret past, both British and Soviet.
Kim Philby's role as a foreign correspondent was to report as a stringer. He wrote plenty of articles. We also know, in fact, that he was in touch with the Secret Intelligence Service fairly continuously and may have supplied that organization with some information. He was also, of course, in direct and constant contact with the Soviets.
But Philby's luck was about to run out. In December of 1962, MI5 discovered evidence that implicated Philby as a key member of the Cambridge spy ring. Working together, MI5 and MI6 sent a representative to Beirut to confront Philby. This time he finally broke, admitting that he had spied for the Soviets. Philby was interrogated on a Friday. By Saturday, he had disappeared.
There is some mystery about precisely how Kim Philby was exfiltrated. The most likely scenario is that he had a meeting with a Soviet handler, that he was taken down to the docks, that he was put on a Soviet ship that then sailed that night to Odessa.
Philby believed himself to be a great hero in the eyes of the Soviets. When he arrived in Moscow, the reception was much cooler than he'd expected.
When he goes to Moscow in 1963, he finally defects. He expects a hero's welcome. Well, he receives a welcome, but he then discovers for the first time that he doesn't have officer rank. He'd fantasized about being a KGB officer. Actually, he never had more than agent status. But it matters so much to him to be important that he spreads amongst British journalists the idea that he's really Colonel Philby of the KGB.
The communism he had fought for and the nation he had worked with to betray his mother country viewed him with suspicion and distrust. He took a Russian wife, Rufina, and struggled to cope with the fact that the KGB wanted little to do with him.
He was disappointed the most about his work, but he was, that's high professional, and he was working so hard, especially for this country, that. And when he came here, he suddenly felt useless.
His KGB handlers made sure that Philby had a nice apartment and plenty of food and drink. But creature comforts mattered little to Philby. For 10 years he'd been consumed with his secret work, and work was the one thing which the mistrustful KGB refused to give him.
They didn't know what to do with him. They isolated him completely, so he was in a golden cage. Philby was not a man who needed money. He didn't, that was nothing for him. He needed some ideology.
The Cambridge Five had begun spying, at least in part, from a desire to improve life and perpetuate freedom. In the Soviet Union, Burgess, McLean, and Philby found an environment of repression, mistrust, and fear.
Donald McLean, of all of them, right to the end of his life, was the most highly ideologically motivated, and kept on writing pressing letters to the Soviet leaders saying, why are we behaving in this manner? What's happened to the revolution and the ideals of Marxist-Leninism?
It is now undeniable that much of Kim Philby's work was ignored or misinterpreted when he first provided it to the Soviets. Philby was one of the great spies of the Cold War, but often his secrets were dismissed or overlooked.
The final tragedy of the Magnificent Five was that the KGB was never really able to use their talents to the full. The Soviet Union actually learnt very little from them. Why? Because the system simply could not absorb what they were saying. Even during the Cold War, the KGB was tremendously politically correct.
While Philby, Burgess, and McLean were in the Soviet Union, Anthony Blunt had become a respected art critic back in London. In the 1960s, Blunt struck a secret deal with MI5. They were certain Blunt was part of the Cambridge ring, but they couldn't prove it. So MI5 offered him immunity if he would divulge the secrets of the Cambridge spies. It was a decision that would prove controversial once the public discovered Blunt's true identity.
There is a myth that the British intelligence community sought to cover up what Anthony Blunt and others had done because, it'd be just too embarrassing if it was discovered that the keeper of the Queen's pictures, Sir Anthony Blunt, before he was stripped of his knighthood, had actually been working with KGB. That's not the case. It is simply tremendously difficult to secure a conviction for espionage unless you actually catch somebody doing it.
In 1979, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher discovered Blunt's deal with MI5. She exposed him in the House of Commons, and the Queen stripped him of his knighthood. John Cairncross lived out his life in Italy and France. He was the last to be revealed, the fifth man. When he returned to England, time had healed many of the wounds that his treachery had inflicted. But his old habit of covering up and avoiding the truth remained intact.
Can you say whether you ever passed any secrets?
That is a matter on which I could only reply no comment. There were certain accusations against me, certain evidence. That was examined, and no action was taken. I am entirely unable to add to these because certain rather delicate issues are involved.
But the truth was soon revealed. John Cairncross had indeed been one of the first atomic spies. Harold Kim Philby died in Moscow in 1988. The times had changed, and along with them, the Soviet perception about Philby's service and contribution. He was given full military honors and buried in Kuntsevo Cemetery, the resting place of many distinguished war heroes and honored citizens. In the end, the Cambridge Five risked it all for a system that today lies in ruins, and there are still many unanswered questions about their activities. Pertinent MI5 files remain secret, and many of the MI6 and KGB files are still under lock and key. The full story of the Cambridge Five may never be known. What is known is that the Cambridge Five will go down in history as one of the greatest spy rings of the 20th century.